Hi, welcome everyone to this Taos Institute Taos Conversation. We're happy to have you here, and we are here this morning. Actually, we'll say a few words about the Taos Institute first. So we are a nonprofit educational organization. We offer workshops, events like these. We have an online community, the Taos Institute Commons, and we promote social constructionist, relational, and appreciative theory and practices. So we are glad to have you all join. You can keep following our activities and get our announcements on the Taos Institute Commons, which is www.taoscommons.com. And I will get started right away by introducing our guests. So we are here today with Derek Gladwin, Naoko Ellis, Sheila McNamee, and Celiane Camargo-Borges. So thank you so much for hosting us this today, and you can take it from here.
Great. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new faces. So we're looking forward to this conversation. I'm Sheila McNamee. I'm a founder of the Taos Institute and the vice president. And so, Celiane, why don't I pass it to you? You can say a few words about yourself and then we'll get started.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you here. Thank you for coming. My name is Celiane. I'm talking from Amsterdam and also part of the Taos Institute community, sitting at board and also faculty, facilitating some courses. We are just about to start our fall social constructionist course online. I see some of you are already enrolled, and I'm glad to see you here today. We have two great people with us today, and this is Derek Gladwin and Naoko Ellis. They are both professors at the University of British Columbia, and they are co-founders of the Systems Beings Lab, which Sheila and I started collaborating with them. We have been talking about partnerships, collaborations, and we would like to share with you today, having a dialogue about possibilities when we think about relational approaches, systems thinking, constructionism. And I would like to invite the two of you, Derek and Naoko, to share a little bit before we start our dialogue. Share with us a bit more about this lab, and maybe you can say, you can add some uniqueness of the lab, or why do you guys believe this is relevant for our nowadays society and academia? Thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, well, thanks. We're thrilled to be here. Great to see everyone. We like this format. The sort of conversational dialogue format. I think is fantastic, and it's nice that so many of us have showed up. We follow the Taos Institute, been part of many of these ourselves, and so it's really great to sort of be in this mix and be able to I don't know, sort of, I guess, quite literally co-create with each other here. I mean, that's the intention I think we all had with the questions, to really sort of engage. So we'll kind of give a little bit of overview as Celiane said, and we'll kind of, be quite brief about that so that we can kind of dig in all collectively. But maybe we'll chat a little bit about Systems Beings Lab and kind of, tie that into ultimately social constructionism and relationality, and how those have been very informing in kind of our practices around systems and education, but also beyond education and other kinds of formats within society.
Yeah, so Systems Beings Lab initiated from thinking around systems thinking, but beyond systems thinking, and looking at some of the complexity of social challenges that we face. We realized it's really understanding that we are a part of the system, and how do we engage with that in so many different levels and areas. We were looking at our students to say, well, this is one thing that they should all really understand well. So we've done many experiments at the university, but ultimately thought that it would be very cool to have a Systems Beings Lab, which is kind of pushing the boundaries of disciplinary silos and come together to do some interesting projects. I guess that's, I'll leave that.
Yeah, and just really seeing the interconnectedness of so many aspects of the work that we do. Naoko's trained as a chemical engineer, and I'm in environmental education, but I do some art stuff too. So we're kind of very disparate in that sense, but we're also very interdisciplinary, and we see all these things that are actually completely interconnected as kind of really these ecological systems that we're a part of. So it feels a little almost counterintuitive or abstract to think about ourselves in systems, but of course that's what we are. We're ecological beings. We are very much dependent upon the systems that we're in. And of course, these systems are largely socially constructed, many of them. So really acknowledging that those aspects of them, whether they're discourses or whether they're biological or whether they're social, and all the ways in which that we actually have quite a significant hand in shifting those systems, and really looking at what we're kind of quite interested in environmental work around systems change. We see sort of with climate change, the real aspect of that of fundamental shifting is systems change, and how we really think about that is much less of a linear kind of causal sort of aspect, but quite relational. And so one of the we can send you some links right now in the chat, but one of the frameworks that we use a lot with our students, but also in workshops and outside of academia as well, with different kinds of groups, and even ourselves. And we should acknowledge that we work together. We're also partners. So we use a lot of this even in our own relationship. And it's funny because we joke, we're like, God, we can't even do this, and we're trying to teach this stuff, like we're trying to implement this. So there's a real kind of sense of therapeutic practice within this. But one of the frameworks that we draw on is what we're calling an ARC framework, ARC, and it's just affective, relational, cognitive. And so, academia or education is, well, society largely, right, tends to be quite cognitive, and how we just use our brain and we train our brain. But of course, it's a very limited knowledge and a very limited way of understanding the world around us. So we sort of added these elements. We didn't personally, we drew on these kinds of other elements of the affective, often considered emotional, but it goes much deeper than the emotional. It's more of a experiential, how we understand intensities, how we understand our bodies in space, and how they interact with other people and that sort of thing. And then, of course, the relational, which this group is much more familiar with, and how we co-create and how meaning is created, between the subjects, as it were, not just the individuals. So we take, we take a very non-individualistic approach to this work. And, so that kind of framework that we use, we apply to kind of when we're educating or we're doing workshops, and, and it's a struggle because the cognitive is very much of a well-trained and useful tool that many of us have. But once we start kind of finding that balance with the other, it opens up lots of possibilities. So that's just kind of a bit about some of what we're kind of doing, and where we started collaborating with Celiane and Sheila on this. And now we're kind of here and trying to experiment a little bit more with other people in a real relational way. So that's kind of I guess where we can dig in a little bit more. So Celiane, maybe you I don't know if you want to go to a question or what you're thinking. Oh, and we did put some links in the chat in case you're curious about. We have a website, couple writings about it, that sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you for the links. As all of you have seen, in the invitation, we have 4 questions that could kind of trigger or invite into the dialogue. And the last one is more related to how you see all these elements playing a role in your own context. But please feel free to also engage with us with the other questions. And I just would like to read the first question, which is, how do relational approaches manifest in our lives? And when I was thinking about this question, it immediately takes me to the next question. What challenges do embedded dominant Western frameworks pose in developing more relational connections? So I think these 2 questions are quite interrelated, as I believe these dominant Western frameworks, they kind of prevent us from seeing those relational approaches developing in our lives, we are so well trained, as you said, Derek, we are so well trained in this dominance of individualism. So we are trained in this framework, such as having this individual rationality, seeing language as representation, all this narrative of progress. And I would say when we approach from the constructionist perspective, we don't think of individual rationality as something each person has on their own, right? Instead, we see it as something that comes from the way people in society organize themselves. So it's pretty much a byproduct of our cultural conversations. So rationality isn't just about how one person thinks, but how we together agree on what we make sense. So people coordinating together their actions, they end up understanding what it means to be rational based, their understanding, and how those cultural norms and conventions kind of create this framework. And I guess the invitation here, the constructionist invitation, is how can we review some of these assumptions, and how could we see these assumptions as one possible entrance to the world and not just the ultimate truth? And how could we develop another entrance, which is this more relational and systemic entrance? And when we open this entrance, then I think we start paying more attention at these relational approaches manifesting our lives. Then it's almost kind of a revelation to see how everything we are living here and now is so much interconnected to our systems, to our families, our education, our society as a whole.
I wanted to just make two little comments here. One is that this notion of that you're raising, Celiane, about what's rational and getting out of the cognitive. I just want to pay tribute to Gregory Bateson, who, long ago said, mind is social. And I think that that's such a beautiful way of expressing and entering into this relationality, that, the mind isn't in here, it's out in what we do together and how we engage with each other. And the other thing I wanted to underscore is, Derek and Naoko, when you were talking about your lab, it wasn't just cognitive and relational, but it was also the connection with the environment and with our material surroundings. And I think a lot of early social constructionist work ignored that. And I think that that's really important, that we are coordinating with our environments and with the material world all the time and making meaning that is not us making meaning, we're making meaning with that environment, in a collaborative way. And so that's really important to hold on to that and not just think about people relating to people, but relationality is being much broader than that. So how, Derek, Naoko, how does relationality manifest in your work?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think it's something that we think about a lot, and we try to employ a lot. And I suppose it's, the question for us is how do we co-create in ways where we are, moving outside of an individualistic paradigm. And this is kind of where the question 1 and 2 come together. And we work in a world that very much prizes the individual. I mean, as a education, it's about what does the individual do your whole life. You are, as an individual, are working in isolation to build this knowledge. I mean, that's the old idea of it that's still quite pervasive, even today. And there are ways in which that's being innovated and of course challenged and dealt with. And so, we are obviously in that camp. But there's a lot of still of the remnants of the older kind of individualistic aspect. So I suppose for us, it partly comes from work in that way. But like we said, we kind of joke, because in some ways we're, even with us, we're trying to enact kind of that practice even with ourselves of, you know, how do we, you know, come into a melded state, or how do we, you know, instead of two individuals kind of going about the world, what does it look like when there's this kind of, you know, co-creative aspect in relationship? And of course, you know, the closer and more intimate you get, the more challenging these things, you know, develop. And so we're just being very vulnerable and honest about that aspect, you know, that it's employing kind of almost in a space with students and colleagues where, or, you know, when we do workshops or whatever else, where that's something that we put out quite initially, that this is a perspective we are trying to work from. And we realize that it's a perspective that many of us may be unfamiliar with. And so we kind of have to spend some time with that, and we try to enact it. And I think, you know, sometimes it's easier because probably we're trained cognitively. It's easier to talk about, and sometimes it's more difficult to say, okay, we're just going to practice it now. So what are some practices that we can do that are relational, and we don't necessarily have to speak about it? And so that's where this group might be beneficial, because I think there's ways in which we can do relationality as opposed to just talk about it. But yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, something came to my mind is like what we talk about in terms of where do I end and you begin, kind of thing, where if it is our relationship, it is, I mean, you mentioned melding. It's a very different way, a new paradigm in some ways to look at relationship that way. And just because in the context of Western society, we are quite individual, and we talk about boundaries, and we talk about positionalities, and so yes, and is it possible that we have this other ways of coming together, co-creating something different? And there's a lot to unlearn, is what we're finding. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things that I think is interesting in relation to this is to recognize that both of these ways, and there's a multitude in between, so this is overly simplified, but you know, from an individualist versus a relational orientation, that they're both constructions, right? They're both created ways of being. And so the attempt here is not to say being relational is better, it's the truest form. These are, I like to think of them as options of ways of being in relation to others. And so that kind of pull that you keep talking about, you know, we've been trained cognitively and trained to be individualists, and it's very hard to get out of that. But that's an option. And, you know, you enter into a relationship or into an interaction in that way, and things kind of blow up. And when you know that there are other options, there's a relational orientation, then you can kind of hit the pause button, right? And say, okay, let's start over. Can I try this in not thinking in terms of me versus you, but thinking more in terms of how do we collaborate? What are we making together in this interaction? How are we both or all contributing to create this kind of dilemma or challenge or argument or what have you, or this great time? I mean, whatever's being constructed. And so it's one of the beauties, I think, of a relational constructionist approach is getting out of this right, wrong, good, bad, better, worse, you know, kind of logic, and instead recognizing the plethora of orientations that we can step in and out of, and seeing them as kind of mini experiments in connecting with others. Like with some people, for example, those of you, and many of you here are therapists, you know that you know, sometimes a client may come to you and expect you to adopt a very individualist stance. And to the extent that you refuse to do so, you're not being relational. But if you step into that, then you are actually accepting their invitation to connect with them. So there's just a lot of different ways of looking at this. Lois, I see your hand is up. Hi, good to see you. You're muted.
Hello, great to see you both. Celiane, Sheila, and to meet everyone else. I'm feeling a confusion, which is probably a good thing. Because it sounds like all the four of you sometimes are using relational ontologically and sometimes as an option for how to see or how to be or how to, quote, relate. And they are related. However, if we start with the ontological, quote, fact of relationality, which is, I think, where Derek and Naoko were starting, then I think how you develop practices that help people see relationality would be different than if you didn't start with that. And by that, I mean, I don't think a therapist or a teacher is ever not relational, in the sense that the kind of relationship that people are developing might be a horrible one, and it might be one that fosters individualism and diagnosis, and we could go on and on and on, but it doesn't mean they're not, that they haven't been developed and they aren't in a relational intertwining, I guess. So the reason I think this is important is that then I get kind of hung up in that being relational is optional, but it isn't in a very important sense that we all, I think, agree with. So then what does it do when we speak about it as an option? Oh, I could be relational now, or I could just be whatever. And I'm just playing around with this because it's so important in the work that I do around the world, in particular, because these words have so many different meanings, or they don't even exist. I mean, when I work with my Japanese colleagues, we work hard to figure out what does in relation mean. And so that's why one of the reasons important to me is the cultural and national border issue and what the language is. So I've said a lot, and I could stop, but just one other thing about this affect, relational, and cognitive it's a similar issue. Affect and cognition are relational. So I'm just not sure the separation between those things.
Thank you, Lois. I just want to do a short reflection here, but I will go after Bruce. Bruce, please go ahead. I see your hands up.
Well, I was just going to tell a story since Lois mentioned Japan. It reminded me of something that might be relevant. So I have a friend who worked for many years at the museum that was the art museum associated with Harvard, and I'm trying to remember what the name of that museum was. I was just trying to Google it, but I can't remember right now. So in part of that position, she would sometimes be responsible for taking shows to different countries. And she related to me once that she had helped set up a show in Japan. And she said, here's how it happened in Japan. I've never seen anything like this before. The people who were responsible, now, let me back up a second. I don't know if you know what all would be involved in setting up a show, but you've got a room then that has basically nothing in it. It's got some walls. It might not have the walls in the right space. They're not painted the right color. There's nothing, the lights aren't arranged in the right way to show that whatever's going to be shown there. So there's basically, it's a blank, the room itself is a blank canvas in some way that's got to be modified. So that means everyone from painters to cleaners to the people handling the artwork to everything has to be involved in getting this show set up. It's a big production. So she said everyone got together. They brought everyone together and they sat in a circle. By everyone, I mean the cleaners, the people who painted the walls, the people who did all the things. And they went around the circle and they said, well, they knew mostly, since they knew each other, they knew what their jobs were. So they wouldn't have to say what my job was, but they said, in order to get to my job, I would need this to be done by this time. And another person would say, to do my job, I would have to have this being done so that by about this time, so that I could do my job. And they went around like that. And she said the whole show came together in such a easy and fast way. She'd never seen anyone do anything like this before. That's my story.
It's a great story, Bruce, and it reminds me of a colleague of mine who was a heart surgeon, and the same thing. He would have like the people who prepare the food, the people who came in and cleaned the floor in the hospital room, and everybody come around the bed and introduce themselves and say, what can I do for you? How can I make this? And those patients who received that kind of treatment were out of the hospital in like minimal time in the hospital and really good recovery as opposed to others. So I think there's a lesson here in the doing. I mean, I like what you said earlier that I think, Lois, you said it, maybe, I'm pretty sure, the difference between doing and talking about it. How do we perform being relational when we are always anyway relational? What does it mean? What's the edge that we're talking about here that is the difference, that makes a difference to, again, raise the specter of Gregory Bateson, one of his famous quotes. But Celiane, you and I think Derek and Naoko have also things to say here.
Yeah, just I find fascinating how in also each culture understanding comes in different ways. I live in the Netherlands, and sometimes we have a group of researchers here going to Brazil, and then they bring this co-research approach and participatory approaches to Brazil as a methodology to realize that most of places in Brazil, this is the way people do it. There's no other way to do it if you don't participate with your participants, if you don't engage with them, especially with traditional communities. So this is not a methodology, this is our way of being. So it's fascinating, but I like your provocation, Lois, because I think this is a very interesting conversation that on one hand, you want to deconstruct this idea of essence as if we have this essence that we were born to be. At the same time, you believe that we are relational by nature. And so we want to talk in the ontological level, we are talking the epistemological level. And I never forget the time I spent with you, Lois, at the East Side Institute, where I learned about the performance theories and we as performatory beings, and start to be critical about, okay, what are the implications of performing this way in society? What are the implications if I develop a different type of performance in my society, in my families, with what kind of reality might emerge? And I feel like this is much more useful to me than if I try to really dig into what is the ontological part of it. Don't know if it makes sense, but I think this is quite an exciting conversation.
Thanks. Yeah.
I think Bruce's story reminded me of this when we work with students and we talk about, so here we are, we're, gathered here together. And we often talk about, well, how do we show up today? Or well, we start with checking ins and how are you and whatnot, but how are we showing up today? And Bruce's story about, people showing up and kind of knowing where they kind of need to be. And it sometimes it is, yeah, it just gets embodied. And sometimes when it does work, it is a beautiful flow of co-creation. That is not to say that perhaps in your story that each of them knew what needed to be done, but they're not focused necessarily on, themselves, but more about what is it that needs to be, like, how do I need to show up to get this done together? That kind of reminded me.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I agree with Celiane, and in your sort of provocation, Lois, because I think in different environments, you might approach differently. Like even talking about a relational ontology and in certain, groups that we're working in would go nowhere, and so it's just more you and practice or embody it. But of course, in an educational context, yeah, we are talking about sort of what is the ontological systems that are the dominant ones that we exist in, and in the Western world, and particularly in Western education, there is a more dominant ontology, and that ontology is not so relational. It's much more individualistic, but that's not to say there's not relational aspects within that ontology either. Whereas obviously in other cultures, and Celiane touched on this, there are much more of a fundamental sense of relationality that doesn't even need to sort of necessarily be talked about or constructed. And one of the metaphors we oftentimes use is just of soil, and how do we cultivate certain kinds of soil. And it's basically a social constructionist metaphor, right? But it's just without using that language sometimes to say, if it takes about 7 years to take, if you have sort of a monoculture and you're trying to create a regenerative sort of garden or soil, I say it takes about 7 years to get to that point, right? And so, and it's also an auspicious number because 7 is kind of like, it takes a long time, basically. It's not exactly 7 years, but it's not quick. It takes some effort and time, and eventually you cultivate a different soil. And how do you cultivate that soil? What are you doing in order to create the language, in order to create the behaviors, in order to create the attitudes that might shift into something that you want to shift it into? And I think that's also part of when you're in our world, much more of that individualistic kind of ontological paradigm. And we personally, I think value the benefits of how relational approaches are shifting that paradigm, or at least making the multiplicity of paradigms possible. I think that's kind of the effort, is that there doesn't have to be just one dominant. We can actually move between different kinds of ontologies, and there doesn't have to be a dominant one. But many are existing and kind of dancing with each other, just like kind of the affective, relational, cognitive. They're not separate. They're not in each one, but you're always in part of them. They're kind of all blurred. And sometimes you're much more in one than the other, but they're all interacting off each other, just like a system. You can't isolate yourself. You're always interacting with the nodes in the system. But what kinds of meanings are you making between those nodes might differ depending on, the type of system that you're in, the values that you're putting in, how you're kind of creating that soil. But we're also kind of curious, because I think this is kind of a fundamental question of sort of all the questions. So I don't know if anyone else wanted to sort of jump in or yeah.
No, I thought Eric might have
Oh,
something.
great. Yeah. And Eric, if you were ready to get in, or anyone else.
Well, my question was back to something Sheila was saying, so I don't want to interrupt the flow.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah.
Okay. I was really curious about the comment, if we refuse clients' ideas, we aren't being relational. But what happens if the client's ideas are steeped in, pathologizing and self-blame and internalized negative center? And, I supervise trainees, and a lot of them are like, they want to talk about attachment work, and they want to talk about love languages, and they utilize these socially constructed or therapeutically constructed definitions that, if you're postmodern in general, you feel are harmful or are very thin storied. So I was really struck by that, is, well, how do we not refuse their ideas but yet be relational, and then utilizing a theory to at least center ourselves within, to map how we work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I guess, you know, it it brings to mind an old Bob Newhart skit. I don't know if you're familiar,
Oh
but
yeah.
do you know the Stop It skit? It's he's a therapist, and this young woman comes and she explains her problem, and she keeps using the language of pathology, that it's because of her relationship with her mother, or it's because of this, and he just keeps saying, stop it, stop it. That's his therapy, is, you know, just stop it. And so I guess it I'm not advocating for approaching a client like that and saying, oh yeah, well, you know, yes, you probably are clinically depressed, or, you know, you do have attachment problems or what have you, but not to just dismiss it either, right? So to start with that, you know, in the improv world, you know, you say yes to the mess, you know, so you accept what they bring to you and take that as a starting point to expand and open up, and, you know, perhaps, you know, come to a point where you can offer alternative stories to that pathologizing story and so forth. So that's,
Yeah.
I mean, you know, really, you know, Lois in her work on performance and improv, you know, can probably speak to that as well. But, you know, to accept it, to always accept it
Sure.
and move from there. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have done numerous exercises with our students, and doing the yes and going around and building that story together. But coming back to the soil metaphor, we used it a lot. And what we found were, when we got the students together to work together, they were like, okay, what's the output here? What am I gonna, you know, how am I gonna contribute? What are we gonna do here? And we wanted to kind of pull back to say, okay, is it possible that we focus on the process here? So in the soil metaphor, we would say, okay, maybe we got together to grow a big tomato plant. But is it possible that we actually may not think about the tomato plant, but we're going to really think about conditioning the soil, thinking about how do we show up every time we meet, and just really be in the presence of the group, and see what kind of things may emerge at the end of the term. Very, very hard concept in terms of focusing more on the process rather than the outcome. And yeah, it's one of the systems practice as well, in kind of stepping back and kind of being able to be in the presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we should contextualize a bit. I mean, we work in a lot of contexts, but we kind of most recently have been running a sort of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary PhD program focused on climate emergencies. So we have a bunch of different kinds of students from different disciplines who are really engaging in dealing with the climate crisis on some level or another in their research. And we work with different kind of external stakeholders, which are the metropolitan governments and different kinds of organizations around that. So they kind of work both in the university, but also externally with some of those groups. And so, you know, some of those practices, I think, they're problem solvers. That's why they're there. They're there to solve a problem, and that's the climate emergency. And yet, you know, we're sort of saying, don't focus on the climate emergency. You know, cultivate the soil, and it's very difficult to sort of think that way, because, you know, they want to go immediately to what's wrong. But of course, you know, then they're sort of still kind of, I don't know, how would we, you know,
In the same mindset.
yeah, a bit in the main, and like Naoko said, it's more just trying to, you know, it's that counterintuitive way where when you are in process, it's not that you're ignoring the outcome, but you're in much more of a present state in order to deal with the outcome, whatever outcome might occur, because that problem might not really be the problem. And I guess appreciative inquiry is the same way, right? And rather than sort of go to the issue or look at the problem, you kind of look at what's doing well, and you kind of cultivate the soil in a different sort of way and see what emerges and manifests. And that ultimately kind of deals with that problem, but that's not the focus of the work. And then we found that's a very difficult thing, because I see there's a Kristen, you mentioned, how do you cultivate the soil? It's a very difficult thing to sort of say, don't focus on the problem when people are getting a PhD to look at a problem. Um, so that's the paradox of it, I suppose.
I like the idea that John Schotter used to talk about the distinction between planning and preparing in terms of this focus on process. So if you plan something, you're likely to execute that plan. So, okay, this is the problem we're facing and this is what we're going to do about it. Or this is the client coming in for therapy and here's, what I want to talk about with that person today, et cetera, et cetera. That instead of planning, if we prepare, which means we might go through the same process, but in the moment, we never know what we're going to do. And I like to talk about that as being radically present, that you are like in the moment, in the interactive moment, instead of thinking beyond. Now, that doesn't mean you aren't thinking beyond as well. I mean, I think it would be difficult for us all not to, but you try to put more emphasis on what's happening right now and what are we all contributing to make this thing that's happening happen? How are we all participating in that unfolding, ongoing process? There was one other thing I was thinking of too, in terms of this kind of ontological versus, just being or doing. In a lot of this work, we talk about it, we write about it, and in fact, for social construction, we have a long history of writing about it, and a lot of the early writing is very dogmatic, completely contrary to the way of being in a relational mode. And so I think it just has taken some time for us to move into more of a being state than a telling state, let's say. And that is what we are talking about here. That means process, focusing on the process, not the outcome. That means, being radically present. That means, entertaining constantly entertaining multiplicities, multiple points of view and ways of looking at things. And it's a lot to juggle, but it's so radically different from our history of training, where there must be a right method to deal with this problem, to come to this conclusion. And but personally, I would say it sounds hard, but I think it's liberating. I mean, it's really liberating to not have to be the one to know exactly what is the right method to get to the right answer, and to be able to invite those with whom we engage into that quandary with us. What should we do here? So I find it very exciting.
Sheila, I really like the radically present expression, and it reminds us about jazz improvisation. We already talked about improv and yes, and there's a YouTube clip that we'll put it on the chat, but we have the student watch, and this is a part of the soil conditioning stuff we do. Yeah, when you show up and when you try to co-create together, there's not a mistake. Mistake is only because we were not able to be there and be present and radically present.
Yeah, that's a great, for jazz musicians, it's a great notion that there is no such thing as a mistake, because if I take on a solo and I go to the wrong key, the others will follow me and make meaning out of it. So, I mean, it's a beautiful metaphor of meaning making and how we collaborate in meaning making. Bruce.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that Sheila just added that bit about other musicians there, because you can think of improvisation in jazz as something that's solitary. I mean, certainly you're getting, I'm not a musician, but it seems like listening to improvised jazz, that that one person will take the lead and it will be mostly by him and the other person will just kind of fill in the background and things. But there could be, I'm sure there is a kind of improvised jazz where they're all listening and they're all creating something at the same time. So I like that. That helped me when Sheila added that about the other people following that. And it pays right into what I wanted to say. Here's something you might try. So I've done some storytelling, and I like to do group improvised storytelling. So here's how that works. You have a group of people and they sit in a circle, or however you have them. I do it on Zoom. I've done it on Zoom more than I have in a circle. And each person is responsible for essentially one sentence of the story. And then it has to go around the circle and you have to tell a story. Now, I know improvisers do this as a word at a time story, and I don't ever recommend you doing that. Improvisers tend to think that that's an easy exercise, and it's not. It's an extremely advanced exercise that I haven't met anyone, and I've done some work with great improvisers. I've never met anyone who can do that. So do not do one word at a time stories, but and a kind of an idea at a time. And then the idea is not just to come to the end, to get around the circle. The idea is to tell a coherent story. And that is much harder, and that takes some time, and that takes some group building and things. But it's a nice way, I find, to work with a group where you have a desired outcome, but that desired outcome can be thrown away every 5 minutes. And so you start again and again and again. And I find instead of having something you work on for 3 years and now you've got it and now you do it and now it didn't work so well and I learned something from that, you can do it in 5 minutes. And I find that's the way that people learn the best, is just repetition, mistakes, repetition, mistakes, repetition. The hard thing about it is to get people to stay with it when they feel, when you're as the facilitator, you're saying, well, let's try that again. And then the ego can come in and say, oh, well, I failed. I don't want to do this. But can work with that.
Lois. Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, we do a lot of the collective stories, Bruce, and anyway, that's a different topic. What else I've been thinking about, and I wrote one of these in the chat, I don't think it was clear enough. In some ways, I'm asking a question for everybody. In the source of the resistance seems to me part of the resistance of students, clients, people, ordinary people to what we're talking about has to do with the belief, the fear that it negates something. So that focus on process implies perhaps a negation of product, and focus on the relationality implies perhaps a negation of me. Who do I get lost? Do I get lost if I'm building an ensemble? Do I get lost? No, you actually become much more of who you are as an individual person. So I'm wondering to what extent, because we do this a lot in our work at the Institute, and how it looks in your work to illustrate, talk about, if you want to, the unity. So I'm thinking of process and product as bifocals, because I don't wear them, but bifocals, one does one thing, one does the other, right? But together you see the totality. So is the way to, the metaphor maybe bifocals, like, yeah, here's product, and my right eye is so good at product, it's really good. My left eye, which is process, is not that great. But when you put them together, I see the totality. And I just think that goes a long way towards the negation, the fear that I'll be lost, or we're just focusing. I mean, in the collective story and improv, the outcome is a story. So you don't lose the outcome. It's just that what the story is and the meaning of the story continuously gets transformed, which is such a great way to show that meaning is socially created and constructed. But anyway, I was really asking about the bifocals and if people find out that if people are experiencing that resistance in that way.
I think one of the things that is useful to hold on to is this idea that we live in language, and language by definition is divisive. I think it speaks to what you're raising here, Lois. Okay, once we say process, then what's the opposite? So, oh, we're focusing on process, so we can't look at product, or it's relation, so it's not about me. And so, we live in language, we have to deal with that. So and the way I think is useful to deal with that is to recognize it and recognize that every time and when I say language, I mean all embodied activity. I don't mean just words. So anytime we act, if I move left, I haven't moved right, so we can't avoid that. But if we know we can't avoid that, then we can constantly be in this self-reflexive process of asking, how else could this have gone? What else could I have done? How might I look at this? And so it invites us into this space of unending multiplicity and plurality. And that, I think, is a shift in orientation completely for us. And so it kind of loosens or allows us to give up this, oh, am I getting lost because everything's collaborative here? And what about me and my great talents and my brilliance and all that kind of stuff? It allows us, it frees us, it loosens the grip on that kind of bifurcation, and instead allows us to kind of see, well, I could look at this from multiple angles, and they all could be useful, and some are more useful than others, and so forth.
Sheila, I would add to that. I would say the legacy of this individualist modernist paradigm is we learn to see everything oppositional. So it's either or. And Sheila and I, we just wrote a book on research, and we talk about the importance of going beyond those dichotomies. If you want to really embrace the complexity of a situation, you need to move beyond this dichotomy. So also as a researcher, to leave this idea of being neutral and objective and separate from your context, to become an agent of change, because you are everything. You are this investigator, you are a participant. The moment you ask a question, you are already being transformed by the question, you're already inviting a conversation. So this complexity, to get to this complexity, you need to move beyond this oppositional. So I don't know if this is the invitation you are giving to us, Lois, to reflect upon.
Mira, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I don't know how to put the hand up on the Zoom. I'm having an interesting experience right now. Like, I love it when we say things like, this is exciting. What that means is we're excited by tension, by holding, by not having to know. And I've gone from supervising and educating counselors who were really excited by these ideas. When I would teach them, they struggled. It's not evidence-based, it's not in the textbooks, but they really appreciated and could feel my excitement. So they got energized by it. But I'm doing a postdoc now in a place where nobody shares this. And I'm really not, I'm struggling. Like, I'm not happy. I'm not getting to do work the way I would like to do it. I think my mentor recognizes what I can bring, but it's like I've gone from being someone who's really appreciated and being seen as a mentor to someone who's just, we don't really have a lot of time for this process that you want. We don't understand it. We don't get it. We have to keep going really fast. So it's interesting to go from when we know what this is, and then to be somewhere where it's not shared. That's it's a really different kind of experience.
And a very, very common one, unfortunately. I wish I had a penny for every time someone raised this challenge. And I think, I mean, it is sort of a test of the both and, isn't it? Like like your preferred way of operating, but in this context you can't. And is there a way to kind of enter in curiously with your colleagues in this context so that you're not, it's not an either or, like, oh, that's not me, that's you. And somehow, without teaching, somehow invite them into a little bit more of a relational way of being. And I think it's the best one can do in a context like that.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm noticing the time, and I wanted to give Naoko and Derek a chance to maybe have the last word.
Oh,
which is, by the way, a really great cocktail. The last word.
Well, surprised us. We thought this was another hour, so that's
Oh,
Yeah.
no, it's
oh well.
Well, to be
We're
continued.
just getting warmed up here. Yeah.
Well, as I was listening, I was thinking around the discomfort and or stamina and discomfort. So stamina in keep doing the work, keep being excited, being the light that others can see in some ways, and at the same time being prepared to sit in discomfort. There's just in different ways, and I guess we don't have too much time to elaborate on that. But do you want to take off from there?
Yeah, I think just a question we oftentimes remind ourselves of is, how do we sit in complexity? How do we sit in uncertainty? And how do we sit in multiple perspectives? And, I think that curiosity and bringing that improvisational spirit in is very helpful and kind of cultivating that relational soil, because it really allows, I think, the possibility of anything to emerge. And like we said, sort of seeing that we're all these interconnected systems and they're overlapping, and really just looking for different kind of leverage points that can be shifted, and then new emergences that happen, and paying attention to those new emergences and kind of going toward it. Again, the improv thing, if something shifts, you listen and you go toward it. You walk into that. I mean, it's contemporary culture, very popular right now. But Cillian Murphy, who won the Oscar for Oppenheimer and all that sort of thing, he's an Irish actor, and I've actually followed him for years, back when he was like in his teens and he was doing films. No one knew who he was. He did a recent interview, and they kind of said, well, what do when you get a part, what do you look for? And he said, I always take the parts that scare me the most, because that's the thing as an actor that I want to go toward. I want to walk to the fear. I want to do something I don't think I can do. And that's what compels me as an artist. And, I think it's similar in some ways. The things that scare us or that create discomfort are the things that are going to, probably expand us the most. And that's part of kind of accepting that uncertainty of all that. So, yeah, that's
great. Great ending words. I really like that, entering, go to the fear. I think we just wanted to end by first thanking all of you for being present, and thank Naoko and Derek for joining us in this conversation, and to be continued for sure. Time goes by so quickly. And also wanted to just let you know a couple of upcoming things from the Taos Institute. In May, the last day of May, the first day of June, a short workshop that I'm giving with Deborah Nathan on relational resilience. She has this, it's really about conflict and how to deal with conflict. She has a great program called Arts Bridge, where for 15 years she's brought Israeli and Palestinian youth together in the summer and taught them dialogue process, and they do artwork together, and it's transformative. And what she says they emerge with is this notion of relational resilience, instead of, it doesn't solve the conflict, obviously, but her work is really fascinating, I think. So that's in the end of May, beginning of June. And then Celiane, you want to say a word about your course? You said earlier it was the fall, but I have to tell you, it's really spring. Maybe in Brazil it's fall.
Oh, did
You're
I
in the
say-
Northern
oh,
Hemisphere now.
Yeah, no, it's just coming up. Next week, we have our first live meeting. It's a 6 weeks course. We're going to be digging into social construction ideas and also how it can apply to your own context. So if you'd like to join us at Commons, you have a place to register.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being
Thank
here.
you. Thank you.
Nice.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.